So pardon me, folks. I'm just in the process of, I just got done with a performance session and now I'm shifting gears. My name is Sean McDonough, and this is what you need to know before you build your modern SharePoint DR plan. Disaster recovery is a topic that's near and dear to no one's heart. But let's see here. Right. So, in the absence of going to Las Vegas, this is the next best thing, I suppose. We are gathered in this virtual conference, and I hope you folks have seen some decent sessions so far. Thank you to our sponsors. Without these folks, these sessions would not be possible. They make the magic happen. So, are you ready for a raffle? We're giving away 3 Oculus Quest all-in-ones. I actually have an Oculus Quest. It is a wonderful thing. My slides are advancing without me directing them. There we go. Oculus Quests are pretty cool, so I hope you get to win one. I'm going to step back there. Let me introduce myself in a second, but consider donating to the following charity relief funds. Everybody knows with COVID going on right now, things are really tough for a lot of people. Many of us who work in the IT and consulting industry, you could sort of say we were prepared for this because many of us work out of our homes, but a lot of folks who work in jobs that require direct interaction with people really could use some support and help right now. So if you're feeling at all in a giving mood, please give to one of these charities. It would really help. So let me introduce myself. My name's Sean McDonough. I'm a Microsoft Office Apps and Services MVP. I've been one for about 4 years now. I've been working with SharePoint primarily since 2004, and I've seen it from many different angles. As a developer, an IT pro, I've been an evangelist, have the collar to prove it, product manager. So I've seen lots of things come and go, and I've seen many things from many angles. These days, I focus on doing development work, primarily around intranets. I build with Acumatica as an accelerator. If you're not familiar with Acumatica, check them out. They're a decent platform. I do a lot of PowerShell scripting as well. I tend to tell people that PowerShell is like methadone for C# developers. It doesn't quite scratch the itch, but it gets you by. So PowerShell is good in a pinch. I have twins, a son and a daughter, Brendan and Sabrina. They just graduated from 7th grade, going into 8th grade. And my wife, Tracy, teaches at a local college, and she is a clinical psychologist, and she runs a nonprofit called the Schizophrenia Oral History Project. So we do a lot of nonprofit stuff around here. I am also a lover of all things donut, and any of you who have seen me on the road have known me to have probably a donut in my hand. I don't shy away from the donuts, and my waistline kind of proves that. So here's our agenda for the next hour or so. What I want to do is build an understanding of what I consider to be the big picture around disaster recovery and what goes into disaster recovery building recovery plans. I want to analyze the disaster recovery process, factors that influence it. I want to explore how SharePoint and disaster recovery come together, because when SharePoint meets disaster recovery, it sometimes produces some interesting results. And nowadays, with the cloud and SharePoint Online and cloud services, things are even more interesting. So I'll also talk about what you need to have to build your DR plan, and I'll cover some relevant things to consider when formulating your plan. So without further ado, so what's up with the Russian nesting dolls? I chose the Russian nesting dolls for this talk for a reason, because I think they serve as a good analog to what I consider to be the big picture around disaster recovery and business continuity. Disaster recovery plans don't exist in a vacuum. Disaster recovery plans should be part of a larger business continuity effort. And that effort oftentimes has multiple levels or layers, kind of like an onion. And like an onion, you're going to want you'll want to cry as you peel some of these back. Doing DR work can be tear-inducing. I say this from experience. I actually was a DR architect before I ever worked with SharePoint. I did disaster recovery work for an insurance and financial services firm here in the Midwest. For their first implementation following Sarbanes-Oxley, and I had to build a bunch of application recovery plans to put into place. And so the strategy that I used to do that kind of informs my approach to disaster recovery. So I've got a long history with disaster recovery. We're going to come at it from the outside, the top-down approach, and we'll drill in from there. And when we're talking about disaster recovery, really it starts with risk analysis. So anytime we're talking risk analysis, we're trying to identify and quantify threats to our business and operations and activities, revenue streams, etc. We want to find the things that can go wrong, things that are going to cause us problems. Data centers flooding, the bulk of I've included, I've been giving DR talks for a long time, and I've talked about illness before, but where we are with COVID right now, in some cases, I'm sure many companies have invoked their DR plans, their recovery plans as a result, because their workforce might be ill. So we're in one of these situations. So cyber attack is certainly a part of that. There's no end to the threats that can be produced and go against us. But what we want to do with a risk analysis is we want to quantify these risks to the extent that we can. And what is the realistic probability of the event? And if the event occurs, how severe would the impact be? And generally speaking, probability times severity equals overall risk. And that's in the sense, the pure sense of just defining risk. But additionally, there are tools that can help us with this in quantifying our risks and rating them in terms of severity and probability. Some of those, I don't have the slides in my deck, but I can call them out. I'll probably do that on my blog after this. So risk analysis is all about, again, quantifying as much as we can overall risk. Now, after the risk analysis comes the business impact analysis. The business impact analysis, in the business impact analysis, we map risks to processes and systems that would be affected if those risks were realized, or rather, if those events were to occur, what would be the effect to our systems? And notice at this point, I'm not even talking about SharePoint. We're doing all of this in the context of Microsoft 365, Office 365. I typically come at this from a SharePoint perspective. We're starting at a much more grandiose, abstract level and getting down to something more technical. And there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. But the business impact analysis is where we, like I said, map risks to business processes. And what we're trying to do is build a matrix of risks. And ultimately, we're trying to get down to dollars per hour of lost time for each element. So if you think of an Excel spreadsheet, line items, each row has a dollar amount associated with it. We're trying to get to something like that. We're prioritizing processes and systems to protect, and we're determining at this stage what our acceptable loss and downtime windows are, because when we start talking money, things get very real for many people. And if you're talking money, you need to talk about loss and downtime, as well as what you can do to avert them, minimize them, etc. So from the business impact analysis, we're going to generate some key outputs. And the key outputs, namely in the terms of RTOs and RPOs, and I'll go into those in a bit, those will be used extensively in later phases of disaster recovery planning. So we move on from the business impact analysis to building business continuity plans. Now, business continuity plan addresses the findings of business impact analysis, and it defines processes to mitigate or minimize interruptions to normal business operations. So contextually, this is the plan, and it may very well be a written plan, or you may have it in electronic form somewhere, but it describes what you do in the event of an event or a disaster. Excuse me for taking a sip there. As you build your business continuity plan, you're attempting to address things that are going to fall away in the event of a disaster. So you're looking for manual procedures and workarounds to keep your business moving in the absence of supporting systems. Many of us rely on our computers. If we didn't have our computers, what would we use? Well, some people might have old Franklin planners, things like that. It's an exercise that you can go very deep in. How deep you go depends on your organization and what you're trying to do. But key information and logistical plans come out of this. If you can't get into facilities, having off-site facilities becomes important and may be factored into your plan. Communication plans come out of this, and disaster recovery plans, specifically recovery plans, come out of this. Communication plans are very important because in the event of a disaster, not everybody quantifies or declares disasters the same way. What might be a disaster to me might not be a disaster to you, but there's criteria that we should be setting for what quantifies or what qualifies as a disaster. And we should be able to use that criteria to objectively evaluate if a disaster occurs. And if it does occur, we need a communications plan to get everybody involved that should be part of the recovery in the event of a loss. The communication plans are oftentimes pretty prescriptive and extensive. They will call out specific people that need to be called, oftentimes by role. We tend to do things by role rather than by individual name, because you can't assume in most disasters that a specific person is going to be available, but rather somebody who can fill that role will be available. So this is the framework. We've done the risk analysis, we've done the business impact analysis, we're in the business continuity plan, and now when we get down into the disaster recovery plan, the disaster recovery plan documents requirements and steps for restoring systems to agreed upon levels of functionality. This is oftentimes the entry point for many IT organizations that don't have a good understanding of business continuity and the concerns that go into it. For instance, I'll use the stereotypical situation. A manager comes in and says, I need to make sure my data is protected. The IT manager throws things on backup. We'll run, nightly backups, make sure everything's backed up. We're covered. We're good. Is that a plan? Well, it's a plan, but does it address the specific needs of the business? That's one of the things we're going to figure out, and one of the things we're going to try and quantify here. So, disaster recovery plans. What is typically found in a disaster recovery plan? It addresses what we need to have in place in order to execute the plan. And with something like SharePoint, if we're in an on-premises scenario, SharePoint obviously has a number of dependencies that need to be in place before we can ever bring SharePoint online. So if we're talking about the cloud, the cloud is a different situation. And, I will address the cloud at some point in this conversation, or rather, I guess, monologue. But the cloud is a different situation and has specific considerations that need to be taken into account. If we're operating in an on-premises environment, we need to get the baseline systems up and running that SharePoint depends upon, things like Active Directory, things like Windows Server, SQL Server, those sorts of things. We may need a facility, and this oftentimes, for organizations that have an offsite DR facility, that's where the offsite facility comes into place. It may be a warm site, it may be a hot site, it may be a cold site. You may be building things anew. It all depends on how you go through this process. We reference dependent information systems and items. We document the procedures for recovery. And most importantly, we document measurable success criteria for recovery. So when I get done executing a recovery plan, I want an objective measure that tells me that I've executed the plan properly and that we're recovered. If I can't do that, I need to write the plan somewhat differently or from a different frame of mind, perhaps. But these things need to be objective, and they need to be documented. So when we go from risk analysis down to the DR plan, you'll notice that we go from more abstract and more concrete, or rather more abstract, more strategic, businessy, down to concrete, tactical, technical. That's where we're at in the process of building a DR plan. So these things go into building a DR plan. We need to do these things. We need to quantify risks and build business continuity plans and whatnot before we ever get to building that disaster recovery plan. I'll talk more about this in a bit. So finally, business continuity, we're drilling down and we're at DR plan. Oops, that's a duplicate. Okay, here we are. Remember the business impact analysis? I talked about key outputs of that stage. RPOs and RTOs are key measures and milestones we use in disaster recovery land for systems. And so RPOs are recovery point objectives. RTOs are recovery time objectives. And I think Microsoft rolled in an RLO, recovery level objective. RPO and RTO are, gold standard across everything. They exist in every industry, but RLO is, I think, a Microsoft creation. So let me illustrate what an RPO and an RTO are by producing a scenario here. So let's say it's the 4th of July. You are enjoying the fireworks in your city, and you are, here in Cincinnati, we typically, they do this at Labor Day, but we'll go down to the river, and that's where the fireworks are shot from. And let's say one of those fireworks goes astray and goes through the window of a data center and into your data center, explodes and takes out a bunch of servers. I know it's a made up scenario, but let me go with this. So we've had an event, a disaster. It's declared at 11 p.m. So when that mortar goes through the window and blows up in my data center, it's 11 p.m. at night. I am starting to, I automatically get alerts. I receive pages and announcements, different pushes, SMS messages probably. So we have a disaster that's been declared at 11 p.m. Now, if my data protection strategy before the 4th of July relied on something like midnight backups, if I've got a system down, let's say it was destroyed, and I want to get back data, I'm going to have to go back to that backup from the night before. That puts us in a position of rolling back time a bit, and RPOs are said to look backwards. So in this case, 23 hours, we're going to lose 23 hours of data potentially as a result. Being a holiday weekend, hopefully it's not that much data, but we stand to lose 23 hours worth of data in this case because the backups are only going to get us to the point of midnight the day before. And so if I were to, look at this in disaster recovery terms, if I've got a nightly backup strategy, I've got a recovery point objective of 24 hours. So I can tolerate up to 24 hours of data loss. So from backup to backup, I stand to lose up to 24 hours of data. Does that make sense? So in this case, we lost 23 hours worth of data, hypothetically, but we could hypothetically lose 24 hours worth of data. And that data, we've deemed to be, I'm describing nightly backups as, this is the effect of the nightly backup. We need to turn this on its head. RPO and RTO are intended to be prescriptive, not reactive. So if I put an RPO of 4 hours on a process, that means I cannot tolerate more than 4 hours of data loss for any particular system. And naturally, RPO windows, as they expand and contract, suggest different technical solutions. Things like tape backups are not appropriate for RPOs that are very small and very small windows, like minutes. Tape backups are not a good solution in those cases. Something like asynchronous data mirroring or replicating replication strategies are more appropriate in those sorts of situations to address that scenario. And those decisions oftentimes come down to dollars and cents. And I've had many a conversation with people. Lots of folks have wanted the platinum standard DR plan, real-time recovery, no data loss or virtually zero data loss. And, in most cases, those systems can be built, but the number of zeros that come after the dollar sign are prohibitive. And once you start showing people the price tags of those sorts of systems, that's when the actual dialogue starts in terms of determining strategies. Because these RPOs and RTOs, they don't come out of thin air. They come out of the business impact analysis. And we try to pick technologies that fit within a particular RPO window or RTO window. So RPO in this case for nightly backups, like I said, is 24 hours. So from 12 a.m. to 12 a.m., anytime a disaster occurs, you stand to lose up to 24 hours worth of data if, a disaster occurred just before the next nightly backup. But oftentimes it's less than that. But this is the window, and this is how RPO is described, recovery point objective. RTO is a little bit easier to envision. If I had a disaster at 11 p.m. and I have an RTO of 8 hours, then I'm in a situation where I have 8 hours to get my system back up and running. And that, like RPO, is not a decision or a call that's made in a vacuum. You build and decide upon RTOs based on your experience with systems, how long it takes to restore them, as well as the people you work with, how accustomed they are to working with your processes and recovery, the different extents to which people are able to go and multitask, how much they've practiced. RTOs can be affected by a large number of factors. So they're not just chosen willy-nilly. Oftentimes you want to rely on certain people, and unfortunately, in certain cases, you can't rely on specific people, and that gets into the process of writing recovery plans, which we'll mention a bit later. So allow me to preach for a second. So RPO and RTO are two values or windows that are driven by business requirements. We saw that in the business impact analysis, and we talked about that in the business impact analysis, where we built that matrix aligning the risks to realized dollar loss line items, the spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet, if you will. RPO and RTO consider tolerance for loss. We know how much it's going to cost per hour, ideally, if things go down. So we want to base our RPOs and RTOs within, we want to make them within our range for tolerance. We don't want to extend them unnecessarily, because these values do matter in real life situations. Now, these are all typically business decisions. And the reason I say this is because if you're building your DR plans, if you are an IT manager and you're building your DR plan in a vacuum, you're doing it wrong. The business has to be involved in the business continuity planning process. So I don't mean to beat a dead horse too much, but if we look at, if you would take a look at this link, this is an article I wrote back in 2009, and it's just as relevant today as it was back then. RPO and RTO are prerequisites for informed disaster recovery planning. If you're an IT manager and you cannot get the buy-in or the investment from your organization that you need to build the plan the right way, have them read this article so that they understand the effect of trying to do this in a vacuum. Because as an IT manager, if you have to build a recovery plan in a vacuum without decent input and, good processes up until that point, you're going to probably get it wrong. And nobody wants their recovery plan to be wrong. So the DR process itself typically is broken down into assessment, planning, implementation, and maintenance. We're not going to have time to go into all of these in depth, but I will start because we're talking about what you need to do in order to what you need to know in order to build a modern recovery plan. We'll talk at least about the assessment and planning stages in some detail. So when we're assessing our systems, we're oftentimes looking at our logical architecture of those systems. We're focusing on SharePoint's software and services. And our goal is to show which pieces of SharePoint are in use, how they interrelate and work together. And it's best to think of this as a bird's eye view of the system. And this is a documentation stage. We're gathering, we're assessing, and we're gathering information about the system. Now, it's important to note that although you may or may not understand, we'll say you understand SharePoint and how SharePoint runs, you cannot necessarily assume that the person who is going to be running your recovery plans understands how SharePoint runs. And so you need to kind of put things in the lowest common denominator in the technical sense. In some systems, it's easier to do than others. Any place where we have to do this within the architecture, it's best to describe what we require as prerequisites or dependencies for recovery plans. But in the assessment stage, we're just gathering information. So we're focusing on software and services. When we talk about physical architecture, that's when we're talking about hardware and actual, servers, switches, what's in play. If you're on-prem, this is going to be everything in the kitchen sink, switches, storage area networks, firewalls, appliances, everything you can think of that takes to run. And most oftentimes this is encompassed within an offsite data center. And so hopefully you will be plugging into, with SharePoint, you will be plugging into some system or some strategy that is already in development, and business continuity can integrate your plans with their own. If you're in the cloud, it's important to note that you are reliant on your provider at this stage. So SharePoint Online, the question comes up, let's talk DR in the cloud. How does that work? Well, have you asked Microsoft lately what the RPO and RTO for SharePoint are? I know that Microsoft tries to get the windows down as small as possible to provide the greatest level of service, but the last time I checked, the recovery time objectives were somewhere around 12 hours, and the RPOs might be down to hours, maybe minutes, 15 minutes, I'm thinking. I could be wrong on that. I'm thinking about System Center and the way it operates. But, you're going to be hard pressed to get a statement out of Microsoft on what its exact RPO and RTO values are. You can get that for dedicated SharePoint Online, but for a tenant in which you and thousands of your closest friends are occupying the same hardware, Microsoft might not go on the record for you. Many people have tried to wrangle them on that and haven't been successful. So if you're working with a cloud partner, it's good to understand what they are doing to protect your data. And naturally, there are things that you can do in addition to whatever your cloud provider is doing. And there are certainly third-party services. In fact, some of the sponsors for this event, you may want to look to them as folks who might be able to provide you with DR services, and they can get your data out in some form and replicate it elsewhere and make sure that that business data that you use is available elsewhere in the event of a disaster. So when you're in the cloud, the terms really kind of change. Configuration data is the first type of data. There are two types of data I generally say that we need to track. Configuration data is the first type, and this is data that is used in the sense of, obviously configuration, but tends to reside in things like the farm configuration database. These are settings for servers, settings for processes, for services, etc. This type of data is typically used when you're restoring systems and trying to build them back. You want to document the configuration data and you want to have a record of it. This type of data is oftentimes easily gathered by third-party tools. I want to give a shout out to the folks at SysKit. There we go. I was going to say Acceleratio. They're SysKit these days, but SP.Kit is the greatest tool that you can use and bring to bear in the case of disaster recovery planning for configuration data documentation. SP.Kit will document your farm from top to bottom and generate a report that you can use to essentially rebuild your farm and get yourself back to the state you were in at the point at which the SP.Kit snapshot was taken. So, you know, SP.Kit is worth its weight in gold. I'm not going to mince words. It's truly an incredible tool. If you don't have the money for SP.Kit, there are ways to do it on the cheap. If you want to go to PowerShell, you can go to PowerShell scripts to do this, and they will enable you to dump farm data. Unfortunately, if you go to PowerShell and you just throw PowerShell at it, it's going to dump all sorts of data, including data you're not really interested in, or data that is highly irrelevant to the recovery process. So you get what you put into the system, unfortunately, as is the case in many things. Now, when you're documenting configuration data, you want to pay particular attention to encrypted data and key sets, things like SQL Server, transparent data encryption, SharePoint's secure store service. These are services that have specific watch-outs when it comes to disaster recovery. In the case of transparent data encryption in SQL Server, there is a set of keys that you need to have available if you are going to recover databases that are encrypted with transparent data encryption. If you do that and you do not have your TDE key set, you will not be able to recover those databases. Similarly, for the SharePoint Secure Store, if you want to get the usernames and passwords back out and in a usable fashion when you're restoring an environment, you need to know the password for that was used at the time when the Secure Store application was provisioned. That password, and Microsoft calls it out when you're building that Secure Store app. So those sorts of things you need to pay very close attention to and capture and understand limitations of what automated processes might not be able to capture for you in situations like that. So business data. If we talk about business data, this is the user's view of a system and what matters the most to them. And if you're in an on-premises environment, 90 to 95% of this data is in the content databases that SharePoint uses. Those content databases, those SQL Server databases, are what's most important, not the configuration data, not the farm data, not anything involved with servers. It's that, you know, those content databases are housing what's important. Now, there are other locations, for instance, the managed metadata store, that might include additional sources of data that you want to capture and store. And there are, you know, it's good to evaluate the entire SharePoint environment if you're on-prem and know where that data is stored and protect it. But the content databases are number one. If you remember nothing else, content databases are number one. And finally, dependencies and interfaces. SharePoint these days reaches out to many different systems. And it can look like it is the system of record for many other systems that is actually fronting data for through things like business continuity services, cleverly built dashboards, all sorts of stuff, SQL databases. So understanding your dependencies and your interfaces is important when you're building your recovery plan or your disaster recovery plan, and you're going to try and do that. So make sure you know where your farm starts, where it stops, where it interacts with other environments. Does it call web services? Does it call other online services? Does it depend on them for any sort of data? Do you have an ERP system online in your environment that SharePoint relies on? Active Directory is a common system. It's a dependency. Do you have other identity systems and whatnot in your environment? Are those important? Should you be capturing those as part of the data you're gathering? So those are the most important things to gather. We talked about, business continuity, business data, configuration data, logical architecture, physical architecture, dependencies and interfaces. You've got all that data. What do you do with it now? Well, now you begin the process of planning. If you've gathered all that data, and that is not a small task, I might add. I kind of breezed through it, but this is the point at which you actually get into the disaster recovery planning process. And this is where you select technologies and your approach to how you're going to build your plan. There are all sorts of factors to consider. I'm just walking you up to the door. I'm taking you to the doorway and walking you in. And I've opened the door for you. Hopefully you've collected all the data you need and you can identify RPOs and RTOs. You've got all of the other business impact analysis, risk analysis. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, there's a site online called the Disaster Recovery Journal, drj.com, I believe it is. They have a lot of good information. The federal government actually has a lot of good information as well in terms of data systems and business continuity planning. So there are resources out there. You might be surprised at what you can get your hands on. A lot of organizations do not give out their disaster recovery planning strategies because they are considered proprietary information. Nobody wants to share what they have to do to recover in the event of a disaster. So getting organizations to cough up what might be example plans and whatnot can be difficult, but there is a process to it. But that's another talk for another day.